So at this time of year, sort of towards the end of April, I get a lot of questions around tender crops, potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers and all those sorts of things. And yeah, a lot of it depends, on your appetite for risk. In terms of, when you plant them out, how you plant them out, whether you keep them at home for a long period of time, how big you want them to grow before you plant them out, and all of those sorts of considerations. I like to take an approach a bit like the way I do it with my potatoes. And I use this framework that I developed, which I just copied from potatoes, so there's no great sort of development effort involved, where everything's kind of described in terms of first early, second earlies, early main crop, and late crop, with a few tweaks for some specific crops. But pretty much everything kind of fits into that model. There are a few tiny exceptions. And with my first earlies, I'm prepared to put quite a bit of effort into the sort of tender loving care of those crops. And I'm prepared to take a bit of a risk with them, and in order to get an early crop. So an example of that would be the strawberries that I grow in hanging baskets in the polytunnel. It's a lot easier just to grow strawberries in the ground and not worry about anything. It's quite a lot of effort to grow them in hanging baskets by comparison. But I just love those early strawberries. Another great example would be the early potatoes. So I do my first earlies really early, and I start them in the conservatory and in small pots, and then I pot them on, and then I leave them in the conservatory until they've broken surface, and then I bring them to the polytunnel. It's quite a lot of fuss and bother, but I'm only doing it really for about 4 pots, the really early ones, and I'm prepared to put that effort in because we're just finishing our stored potatoes right now. In fact, we've got 1 pot left to harvest, and that'll be the end of April. And then the beginning of May, of course, we'll then have new potatoes. And just to have that continuity, it's worth the effort for me. Similarly, it's the same with the carrots. It's worth the effort to do 4 big containers of carrots in October so that they're ready in May, just as the overwintered carrots are finishing. The stored, the ones we store in the ground are finishing. And yeah, so that's what I do with my first earlies. And with my second earlies, I'm prepared to put a bit of effort in, but I generally don't want to take any risk because I do more of those. And then with my early main crop, I don't want to take any risk, and I don't want to put hardly any extra effort in. And then with my main crops, basically that's like the 80, 60, 70% of probably what I grow. I want minimal effort and minimal risk for those, and then a little bit more effort for the late crops. So that's the way I think about everything. So I'm always, a bit of extra effort and a bit of extra risk for first earlies and second earlies, basically, is the way it comes down to it. Now, I know that some people, they don't think like that, and as a result, it's a big risk to do anything early. But I just like the fun of it, and I just, because we're self-sufficient in veg, it's just really nice to have early things. So that's the way I approach it, and I'll just show you what I mean in the polytunnel right now. Because we just had a decent frost in the polytunnel last night. Everything was under its double layer of fleece, and everything was, perfectly happy, but not optimal, because the courgettes and the tomatoes, for example, optimally, they would be above 10 degrees centigrade at night. That's optimal, so that's going to give you the best crop, the most longevity of the crop, and all of that sort of thing. But I don't care about that for first earlies. I don't care about getting the most tomatoes over the longest period. I just care about getting them early. And so, that's not my criteria. But if it was my main crop tomatoes, then obviously I want the biggest crop over the longest period with the healthiest plants and all of that sort of thing. So I will wait for those until it's 10 degrees centigrade at night in the polytunnel. So anyway, that's the way to look at it. So if you look at my beetroot, you know, they're just starting to form decent roots now. And it's the 25th of April today. And, you know, this isn't all my beetroot. You know, this is my first early crop, started in January. Got quite a bit of it. There is a slight risk that it'll go to seed, but then we get all these beautiful leaves. So we don't really worry too much about that. But what we want is a continuity of beetroot. We run out of beetroot in sometime in May, sort of mid-May, early June from the store. And so we want an abundant supply of beetroot fresh from the ground after that. And so these will be ready sometime in sort of the middle of May as sort of, you know, maybe this sort of size sort of beetroot. And the beautiful thing about beetroot is, you know, it doesn't really go woody provided you eat it, you know, within sort of 3 or 4 months. So yeah, we can let them grow and grow and grow, bigger and bigger, and they'll be just fine. So these are my first early potatoes, and you know, we only have about 6 weeks supply here, and these are actually successionally sown as well. So you know, the oldest, there's only sort of 2 tubs of really old ones, and they get gradually younger, obviously. And you know, I always, with the potatoes, I only do 2 tubs at a time, and then 2 weeks later I do 2 more tubs, and 2 weeks later I do 2 more tubs. So I'm doing the absolute minimum that I need just to harvest them, because the later you leave your first earlies, the bigger the harvest is going to be. So yeah, that's the way I do the potatoes, and I kind of do the same with the second earlies. And the way I think about the second earlies is these are, you know, bigger sort of baking potato sized potatoes. And again, I only do the smallest number of those that I need to get me through 2 weeks, and I've got another one sort of down there that, you know, will get me through the next 2 weeks, and then we're on to the main crops really. And same with the strawberries. So I've got quite a few hanging baskets in here, but you know, this is just the number of strawberries that we need to sort of eat fresh on a day-to-day basis. And I actually take some of them out of the polytunnel and put them in the garden, so I get like a fresh pickings from the garden and fresh pickings from the allotment, because we really just like to eat them, you know, truly fresh, you know, like a few seconds after harvest. Same story with the tomatoes. So I've got 12 little tomato plants here. They'll actually sort of come ready over a 3-week period, so they won't come ready all at the same time. I am letting them flower even though they're little, because I want the earliest crop, and I don't really care that that'll weaken the plants a little bit and it won't be optimal, because as I said, these are just the early ones, and these will all be scrapped. So by the time we get to probably late June, sort of July sort of time, you know, I'll have new second early tomatoes, and so I don't really care about these first earlies. I'll just compost them, and because they're in these sort of hanging baskets as well, I don't really want them in hanging baskets because they're just too much hard work to look after. But at this time of year, when it's not quite so warm, I can kind of keep up with watering. Same story with the courgettes. So I've only got 3 courgette plants, and they won't last very long. You know, I generally find that these early plants, probably by, again, sort of certainly by the end of July, I've composted them. So it's not optimal, you know, because courgettes, you know, main crop courgettes can crop, you know, all the way through until October. But again, I don't mind, because by the time I get to July, so that, you know, my main crops will be ready. So these are really for eating just the first few early courgettes in June. And you know, so that's the approach that I take. I know I'm intentionally growing something suboptimal for an early harvest. Same with the early celery. you know, it won't last. It'll last well into July, maybe early August or something like that, and then I'll take it out because I want to get all this bed replanted. But by then, of course, I'll have abundant main crop celery, so I won't mind. And so far, this has all been about tender crops and taking a risk. But when it comes to these early kales, started in January, there's no risk really with these. What there is, though, is, again, this issue that they won't last as long as kales that were sown in March, but they will give me a harvest just as my main crop overwintered kales are going to seed. And these won't go to seed for quite a while, so it'll probably be July before I take these out. But that's kind of just perfect timing for me then to put purple sprouting broccoli in, so I don't mind. And that kind of scenario is not quite true of the peas, because actually these early peas do really well. They have a really long harvest period, and obviously I've got flowers on them now, but they don't seem to, they have probably a longer harvest period than some of my later sown peas. Peas just seem to really like being really well established in early spring, and they just keep on going. It is definitely true of the early broad beans. You know, these, they do give an early crop, but it's only 2 or 3 weeks earlier, so it's not really worth very much effort, and actually it's not much risk either. But they do sort of grow big, and you know, they get in the way in the polytunnel, so they're outside now, so I can put early French beans in. You know, but that early crop, 2 to 3 weeks early, it's just worth that little bit of extra effort to pop them into a pot and compost them early. And same with the early French beans. You know, I really like early French beans. I don't like frozen beans, so you know, again, I'm going to do those in that container. It does mean protecting them if there is a risk of frost, but yeah, I like the fact that I get them a month earlier. But you know, we'll have composted these again in sort of probably early July sort of time. But by then, of course, we'll have our main crop French beans. So, you know, that's the way of it. So if you want more about this kind of approach, then I'll put a link in the description below to this first early, second early framework. And you'll find that all the way through my gardening book. You'll find it all the way through my database. You'll find it, you know, basically everywhere, because that's the way I think about gardening. And if you want to know more about growing under cover and, you know, harvesting early or harvesting late, or, you know, just self-sufficiency in general, whatever, then just look at the ebook as well. There's loads of links down in the description to get you started. So my name's Steve. This is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.